Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Philosophy with Mr. Hands. I am going to be starting off with the first part of the David Armstrong reading, The Nature of Mind. In this, Armstrong is trying to present a case for a purely physical account of man. So in other words, an account of us that doesn't involve any non-physical mind. So this is in response to what we've learnt from Descartes, where he suggests that we exist as both a physical body, but more importantly and primarily as a non-physical mind. What that substance is, we don't know, but our existence is primarily as a thinking thing, according to Descartes. Armstrong is going to present the materialist approach. So grab your readers, grab your highlighters, grab your pens, and let's get started. The first part is relatively straightforward. So I'll rip through the intro pretty quickly, but what we're going to see is that he simply outlines what he's hoping to achieve in this essay. A very common thing that we see in sort of modern philosophy writing. So let's go through it. It's pretty straightforward, so I'll go quickly. Men have minds, that is to say they perceive and have sensations, emotions, beliefs, thoughts, purposes, and desires. So these are the attributes of the mind. What is it to have a mind? What is it to perceive, to feel emotion, to hold a belief, or to have a purpose? Many contemporary philosophers think that the best clue we have to the nature of mind is furnished by the discoveries and hypotheses of modern science concerning the nature of man. So he's making a link here to the work that's been done in psychology to show the nature of our mind and how it works. And as we should hopefully know, if you've already done a pre-reading of this, he is going to be talking about a lot of psychological theories, particularly behaviorism, later on in the essay. What does modern science have to say about the nature of man? There are, of course, all sorts of disagreements and divergences in the views of individual scientists. But I think it is true to say that one view is steadily gaining ground, so that it bids fair to become established scientific doctrine. This is the view that we can give a complete account of man in purely physico-chemical terms. So this is him introducing the materialist argument. What he's saying is that whilst we might not have scientific certainty about this just yet, yet is a really important word there, we can see the, undertow or the current that science is dragging us towards, and he's saying that current is pretty strong now. Whilst it's not established as scientific doctrine yet, to use his words, he's saying that it will be soon enough. And a physico-chemical account of man, what we really mean by that is we can account for all of our experiences, including that stuff that we usually associate with the mind, through a physical explanation, like the neural behavior in our brain, and the chemical explanation as well, which is, the neurotransmitters that get released and the effect that has on the functioning of our brain. This view has received a tremendous impetus in recent decades from the new subject of molecular biology, a subject that promises to unravel the physical and chemical mechanisms that lie at the basis of life. Before that time, it received great encouragement from pioneering work in neurophysiology, pointing to the likelihood of a purely electrochemical account of the working of the brain. So he's talking about two different fields here. Molecular biology is the study of living things or living organisms. Molecular biology, we're studying those things at a much more microscopic level. So this is all through technological advancement. Being able to see things that are much smaller than we used to be able to see them has allowed us to do this. Neurophysiology, anytime you see the word neuro, think brain. And so neurophysiology is the study of the structures of our brain. And by that we mean the physical structures of our brain. And we now have a much better understanding of the way that electrochemical responses affect our behavior. For those of you who do psych, hopefully some of this starts to sound familiar. I think it is fair to say that those scientists who still reject the physico-chemical account of man do so primarily for philosophical or moral or religious reasons, and only secondarily and half-heartedly for reasons of scientific detail. This is quite a strong statement from David Armstrong here. What he's basically saying is any scientist who is presenting the argument that there might be more to us than just our physical being is kind of committing a sort of scientific dishonesty. He's saying they're not doing it because of any scientific reason. They might say that, but what they're really doing it for is for some sort of philosophical reason or a moral reason or a religious reason. Because remember, the materialist view is not really compatible with particularly any religion that suggests any form of afterlife. We know what happens to our body, and it's not going anywhere. So he's sort of saying any scientist that disagrees with this physical account of man and science behind it, they're doing it because they're religious or because they have some sort of moral issue with it or philosophical issue with it, not because there's any science behind it. Continuing on, this is not to say that in the future new evidence and new problems may not come to light that will force science to reconsider the physico-chemical view of man. But at present, the drift of scientific thought is clearly set towards the physico-chemical hypothesis. In other words, the materialist hypothesis. And we have nothing better to go on than the present. For me, then, and for many philosophers who think like me, the moral is clear. We must try and work out an account of the nature of man which is compatible with the view that man is nothing but a physico-chemical mechanism. So this is basically his mission. What he's saying is, well, all of the scientific evidence is showing that we can explain our behavior through physical explanations. So we need to try and figure out all of the philosophical issues and get them to match up with that. We need to get the philosophy to match with the physical evidence that we've got. In this paper, I shall be concerned to do just this, to sketch in the barest outline what may be called a materialist or physicalist account of man. And there it is, Armstrong telling you exactly what he would like to do. Moving on now to the next section, which is the authority of science. You can see in the slide here, I've got, he deals with really two key questions in this debate before actually entering, okay, well, how do we get, the philosophy and the science to match up here? How do we create an account of man that is purely physical? He's going to deal with a couple of other questions first. The first one is going to be, why is scientific knowledge different from other forms of knowledge? What makes science so special? Now, for Armstrong, he's going to point us to one thing that's very different about science than from any other field, and that is that science is the only field that finds consensus among learned individuals. In other words, science is really the only field where if you study the material, you should come to the same conclusion as everyone else. He points to other branches of study like religion or philosophy, and the same cannot be said of those two studies. In philosophy, the more we study the mind-body debate, the more we see that there is some validity to both arguments. You might lean one way or the other, but you should be able to see that you can't really land a knockout blow against your opponent yet. Not to say that you won't, but yet. And so, really, there's lots of disagreement. And remember, we've been talking about this in philosophy for like 2,000 years. So, because science reaches consensus among learned individuals, so people who know what they're talking about all agree, then it is special. It does give us special knowledge. The other question that he deals with is, well, okay, if scientific knowledge is special, that's fine, but is it even qualified to answer questions to do with the mind? His answer to this is maybe not. He's sort of straight up, maybe science isn't best placed for this. But he points out, if not science, then what? Is it philosophy? Because we've just been talking around in circles for 2,000 years about this. So philosophy's not really getting the job done. Is it religion? Well, religion certainly offers key ideas, but most religions seem to disagree with each other. And even if you go within one religion, well, do they have any evidence to support what they're saying? If we take the Christian view that when you die, you're either going to go to heaven or hell, do we have any evidence to support that view? It seems like science is best suited for answering this question, just like pretty much any other question, Armstrong would say. So let's start reading this next section. So the authority of science. But before doing this, remember, he's talking about creating an account of man that's purely physical. I should like to go back and consider a criticism of my position that must inevitably occur to some. What reason have I, it may be asked, for taking my stand on science? Even granting that I am right about what is the currently dominant scientific view of man, why should we concede science a special authority to decide questions about the nature of man? So this is that key point. What is so special about science? Why should we be listening to scientists more than we listen to priests or philosophers? What of the authority of philosophy or religion or morality or even of literature and art? Why do I set the authority of science above all these? Why this scientism? So he's sort of coining a phrase a little bit like racism, thinking that one race is better than another for no measurable reason. Saying, well, why do I hold this view that science is better than all of these other fields? He's going to, as I said, show that consensus is what gives us, or allows us to hold scientism. We have good reasons for thinking science is better than those other fields, and it is a form of privileged knowledge that we get from it. It provides us with more certainty than those other fields do. It seems to me that the answer to this question is very simple. If we consider the search for truth in all its fields, we find that it is only in science that men versed in their subject can, after investigation that is more or less prolonged, and which may in some cases extend beyond a single human lifetime, reach substantial agreement about what is the case. It is only as a result of scientific investigation that we ever seem to reach an intellectual consensus about controversial matters. So Armstrong here is saying it might take science a long time. They might be at it for a while. But what we're going to get at the end is a whole bunch of people who have really studied, really know what they're talking about, and who all agree. And he points out that for most scientists it takes beyond their own lifetime. The vast majority of scientists who develop a theory, in the past at least, that theory hasn't been able to be proved in their lifetime. It wasn't until later on, until technology developed more, that their theories were able to be proved. So it might go beyond a human lifetime, but that's better than 2,000 years. And at the end of it, we actually get an answer. We get to say, no, this is how this works. That's it. There's no questions. Okay, so this consensus, this agreement between learned individuals. In the Epistole Dedicatori to De Corpore, Hobbes wrote of William Harvey, the discoverer of the circulation of the blood, that he was the only man I know that conquering envy hath established a new doctrine in his lifetime. What Armstrong is talking about here is this person, William Harvey, who was the first person to explain how blood circulates around the body. He was kind of the first scientist to come up with a theory and have that proven in his lifetime. Pretty much everyone else came up with theories, they got proven, but they were long dead by the time that happened. So he's just making that point. So before Copernicus, who gave us the first view of the solar system, before Galileo, who was the first person to seriously say that the Earth rotated around the sun and not the other way around, and Harvey, who was the blood guy, Hobbes remarks, there was nothing certain in natural philosophy. Now, if you ever come across this phrase, natural philosophy, they're talking about science. We don't call science natural philosophy anymore. Now we call it science. That's all it means. Natural philosophy is science. They're one and the same thing. And we might add, with the exception of mathematics, there was nothing certain in any other learned discipline. These remarks of Hobbes are incredibly revealing. They show us what a watershed in the intellectual history of the human race the 17th century was. Before that time, inquiry proceeded, as it were, in the dark. Men could not hope to see their doctrine established, that is to say, accepted by the vast majority of those properly versed in the subject under discussion. There was no intellectual consensus. So in its infancy, he's saying science was just like religion and philosophy. It had all of these great ideas, but none of them could be proven. And so there were competing ideas. with Copernicus, when he suggested the sun-centered solar system, it got shouted down for a very, very, very long time. And not just by the church, although they definitely did their part, by other astronomers as well. Okay, so science was really just like every other field up to that point. So since that time, it has become commonplace to see new doctrines, sometimes of the most far-reaching kind, established to the satisfaction of the learned, often within the lifetime of their first proponents. Science has provided us with a method of deciding disputed questions. This is not to say, of course, that the consensus of those who are learned and competent in a subject cannot be mistaken. Of course, such a consensus can be mistaken. Sometimes it has been mistaken. But granting fallibility, what better authority have we than such a consensus? So with this, what he's saying is, look, could this scientific consensus be wrong? Yeah, it could. Scientists do make mistakes. But even factoring in those mistakes that have happened through the history of science and the times that scientists got it wrong, what we see is actually science still moves in a direction of truth. So it's still the best form of understanding that we have. It's still the best source of knowledge. Now, this is of the utmost importance, for in philosophy, in religion, in such disciplines as literary criticism, in moral questions in so far as they are thought to be matters of truth and falsity, there has been a notable failure to achieve an intellectual consensus about disputed questions among the learned. Must we not then attach a peculiar authority to the discipline that can achieve a consensus? And if it presents us with a certain vision of the nature of man, is it not a powerful reason for accepting that vision? So remember here that Armstrong is not saying that he knows that we are purely physical. What he's saying is that science is suggesting that we're purely physical. Every other field that is suggesting we're not is less reliable than science. So could science be wrong in this account? Yes. We could have a non-physical mind that science might not be able to measure or perceive. But it would make a lot more sense to go with the field that solved more problems for us in the past. Why would we follow a field that hasn't solved anything for us when we've got a field that has and is telling us something? He's essentially saying here that why wouldn't you trust science over philosophy and religion? It's the only thing that's given us any knowledge. Okay, so I will not take up here the deeper question of why it is that the methods of science have enabled us to achieve an intellectual consensus about so many disputed matters. I'd recommend reading Thomas Kuhn and the Process of Scientific Revolution for that, by the way, which we looked at a little bit in Year 11. That question, I think, could receive no brief or uncontroversial answer. I am resting my argument on the simple fact that, as a result of scientific investigation, such a consensus has been achieved. It may be replied, it often is replied, that while science is all very well in its own sphere, the sphere of the physical, perhaps there are matters of fact on which it is not competent to pronounce. And among such matters, it may be claimed, is the question, what is the whole nature of man? So here what he's saying is, science is really good at answering questions about the physical world. It's the authority on that. Does this question fit into that authority? In other words, is science even qualified to answer this question? This is a really important part to understand, because this is why the dualists disagree with this whole premise that science is telling us blah, 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 blah. For the dualists, particularly substance dualists like Descartes, remember, the mind is a non-physical thing. What Armstrong is suggesting here is we should listen to people who specialize in measuring physical things to tell us about something that might be non-physical. So this is how the dualist would respond. Of course, science isn't finding any evidence for the mind. It's not a physical substance, and science only deals with the physical. You'll see here Armstrong, he doesn't disregard that question, but he feels like we can move on from it. But I cannot see that this reply has much force. Science has provided us with an island of truths, or perhaps one should say a raft of truths, to bear us up on the sea of our disputatious ignorance. Great phrase, disputatious ignorance. In other words, disputed or disputatious, so disagreement, and ignorance, not knowing anything. There may have to be revisions and refinements. New results may set old findings in a new perspective, but what science has given us will not be altogether superseded. So what he's saying here is that revisions may take place. And if we think of the theory of evolution here, we can see that happening. We have this evolution is a little bit like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but at the moment we don't have all the pieces. We've got enough pieces that we feel like we know what the picture is showing us. Okay? We feel like we have a clear understanding of the rough time period of the evolution of man. We feel like we have a good idea of what our non-Homo sapien ancestors were and where they fit into our extended family tree. But every now and then, we find new archaeological evidence. Okay? Every now and then, someone digs up a skeleton of a prehistoric human, or, a distant relative of a human, and then we go, okay, so that's another piece of the puzzle, and now the picture has slightly changed. Now, notice here, the picture has slightly changed. We are not getting rid of the picture wholesale. So, a lot of people are like, evolution, it's not really science, it's changing all the time. Not really. Okay, we have a clear understanding of how man evolved. What we don't know is the minute details. And it's those details that change. So that's what he's saying. Science has given us things that might need to be revised and trimmed and pruned and refined, but very rarely do we get things that are totally disregarded. Must we not therefore appeal to these relative certainties for guidance when we come to consider uncertainties elsewhere? Perhaps science cannot help us to decide whether or not there is a God, whether or not human beings have immortal souls, or whether or not the will is free. So once again, he's pointing out the idea of, well, maybe science can't answer these questions. Continuing with the reading here, but if science cannot assist us, then what can? I conclude that it is the scientific vision of man, and not the philosophical or religious or artistic or moral vision of man, that is the best clue we have to the nature of man. And it is rational to argue from the best evidence we have. So, if you remember, last year we talked about different styles of argument, and one of them is argument from best explanation. That is what Armstrong is doing here. He's freely admitting, could this be wrong? Yes. Is science the best field for, or the absolutely correct field for answering this question? Maybe not, but it's the best one we have. And so maybe we should listen to the best answer we get. Right? It's kind of like going to see the doctor, and the doctor telling you, okay, well, you need to stop smoking because you're going to give yourself lung cancer. And then you go to a fortune teller and you say, am I going to get lung cancer? And they say, no, you're going to live to 105 and you're going to die in your sleep in your bed and you'll never have cancer in your life. I mean, which of those should you listen to? Is it possible that the doctor could be wrong and you never develop lung cancer? Of course. Lots of people who smoke don't develop lung cancer. But the doctor is saying something because she has evidence for what she's saying. Okay, there's a lot of evidence to show that if you smoke cigarettes, you're going to end up with lung cancer. Maybe you should listen to her over the fortune teller. Okay, the fortune teller has no evidence. This is essentially what Armstrong is saying here. If we're asking a question like, oh, do we exist as a physical body or a physical body and a non-physical mind? Maybe we should listen to philosophy. Maybe we should listen to science over fields like philosophy and religion. They're the only ones with evidence. Okay, so that's the first part of the reading. We'll talk about it in class. Hopefully it's relatively straightforward. And please make sure that you go on to the next section of the reading, which is the real meat of what we're discussing, defining the mental. So this is now where Armstrong attempts to actually give an account of the mind that we could potentially explain in a purely physical way. Okay, I'll answer any questions that you've got. Just let me know, and thanks for tuning in. See ya.